Well, hello. It's good to be with you, and it's good to be here in the desert. We've got a Bedouin tent, a goat hair tent, and we're going to think in this session about the desert dwellers, and we're going to go back to the time of Abraham. We have Abraham's servant here, and that looks like somebody from the family. And I can't see Abraham at the moment, but perhaps he'll be along in a moment or two. We're going to read, first of all, from Genesis chapter 12, and from verse 1. And this is about the call of Abraham. The Lord had said to Abraham, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abraham left as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out for Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all his possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. And then in the letter to the Hebrews, there's just a little explanation about Abraham and what the situation there when he was called by God meant. In the faith chapter of Hebrews, in chapter 11, and in verse 8, we read these words. "By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he made his home in the promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder was God." And so we see in those words from Scripture that Abraham was 75 years old when he was called by God to go to the promised land. And then we read how God made a covenant with him. Did God keep his word? Well, of course he did. And we can see that round about us today. And the third thing was that he lived in a tent. And so, as we think about Abraham and the desert dwellers today, we're going to look at the situation that Abraham found himself in. We're going to look at his camel. We're going to look at his servants and those in his family, and we're going to look at the goat hair tent. Hello, we're back in the desert near to the goat hair tent, and we're going to look at Abraham. And we have a costume that Abraham would have worn and been familiar with. This is modelled on a costume that is in the possession of CMJ, Church's Ministry Among Jewish People, and they have a genuine costume, several hundred years old, and I've managed to copy it. Now, as we look at it, we see, first of all, there is what's known as a keffiyeh. And this is a sort of keffiyeh worn by Abraham, who was, among his people, a sheikh or chieftain. And it had several uses. First of all, it would protect the head from sun, so he didn't get sunstroke. And then also, you could pull the keffiyeh up and right across the nose, just allowing a slit for the eyes, and when there was a sandstorm. So it was very useful and ideal for desert conditions. And the next thing was this band, this coil, which kept the keffiyeh on. And this was doubled over and wound around the head, and this is called an agal. Now, the agal was used at night when the camels were outside the tent. Now, I'm not a betting man, but if you know anything about horse racing, you may have heard the expression about a horse being nobbled. Well, back in Abraham's day and all through the generations with the desert people, at night they would take off their gull, they would put it turn it into a figure of 8, put it up the camel's legs and over his knobbly knees, and that would prevent the camel running away. And so that's where the expression nobbled comes from. The next thing was the tunic inside here, and this particular one is green in colour. Sometimes they were white, just like the friend at the back there, and they had long sleeves for the chieftain and his son. We read, of course, about Joseph, who was the favourite son of Jacob. And we read in the AV, in some translations, it says he had a coat of many colours. And in more modern translations, it says a coat ornamented with long sleeves. And we think it would have been these long sleeves, which you can still see in the desert today among the Bedouin people. And that was a sign of leadership. And a tunic like this would have been worn by a chief and his son. Obviously, if you've got these long sleeves, you can't do a lot of work. And in order to get into the abba, the coat, or the abaya, the cloak, you have to wind the sleeves around your arm like that, and then put your arm through the armholes. And that, as I say, was a sign of leadership. Whoever wore this costume was in charge. The next thing is the girdle. This is made in wool, and just a band of cloth tied round. In some versions of the Bible it's called a girdle, but more often nowadays it's called a belt, for obvious reasons. The next thing is the abba, the coat. You can see on the servant here, he's wearing an abba, a coat with sleeves. He's wearing a camel hair coat. Or this coat here, which is called a cloak. It's an abaya, and it's just a square of cloth really, cut down the middle to make the sort of overcoat, and you put your arms through the armholes. Now, everything about this costume denotes wealth. Every part of it has gold threads in it: the tunic, the cloak, the abaya, and the agal. And so it would be instantly recognizable as someone who was a rich man and a sheikh or chieftain. Now, one thing that the chief had was some sort of pole or staff or stave. Sometimes this would have been a spear. And we've got a spear here. I'm just going to pick that up like that. There we are. And this would have sometimes fancy sort of tassels on the top, just under the spear part there, the metal part. And the chieftain, as he was travelling around, looking for an encampment, he would, when he came to the right place, stick his spear into the ground, and his tent would be pitched next to the spear. And that tent would be in the centre of the camp. So he could have a spear like that. So this is the staff or the stave that a chieftain or sheikh would hold in his hand. as a sign of authority. Now, sometimes in the scriptures, because Hebrew only has consonants and not vowels, you can get different meanings for the same word. And the word for stave or staff is matter. And translated into English, that's M-A-T-T-E-H. But there's another word for bed or bedhead, which is M-I-T-T-A-H. So there's matter or matter. And mate, for the staff, has the vowels A and E, and the mitta for the bed has I and A. Now, in early translations into English of the Old Testament scriptures, in Genesis 47 and verse 31, it speaks about Jacob prophesying, and it speaks about his bed. But in Hebrews, it mentions about the staff. And it seems to be a discrepancy. In later translations, it just speaks about the staff in both passages. And so the staff is the correct translation. It's only because of the way you can read Hebrew. Of course, nowadays they have the vowel points to make it absolutely clear. Now, the staff was the pledge that Tamar asked of Judah, spoken of in Genesis 38. And Moses' staff was his matter, found in Exodus chapter 4 and verses 2 and 20. And so we see what an important thing this was. Of course, you don't see many of these staves like this nowadays. Well, you can't get the staff, can you? We read of three types of people in the scriptures. The first were the desert dwellers, and in Arabic that's Bedouin or Bedouin. And of course, the Bedouin are still about today. And then there are the village people, and they're known as the Fellahin. And then the townsfolk, who are the Beladine. And so the desert dwellers are really on the lowest rung of the ladder. They really exist among sun, sand, palm trees, and camels. And they live in goat hair tents. Now, life among the Bedouin has remained almost the same, unchanged really for the most part, since the days of Genesis. Hot days and cold nights, sun and sand. There are landmarks visible, not visible to us, but visible to them. And they're still able to navigate with their camels across vast spaces of desert. The camels are quite rightly referred to as ships of the desert. And they can subsist on the poorest of food. And they can store water and drink some 27 gallons at one go. Just think of the water that Rebecca had to get from the well for Abraham's 10 camels that were brought to her family by his servant. They're used for transport. Camel dung is used for fuel. Camel hair is woven and made into clothing. And camel meat may be eaten, although it's very tough. Well, I thought I would just give you a recipe. My wife Sally will be speaking about the women of the desert a bit later on. But I'm going to just give you a recipe that's come to me because it's it can be nice to have camel meat now and again, but as I say, it's very tough. Now, this is a recipe. First of all, put the camel meat into a pot. Place next to the meat a large stone or rock. Cover with water, place on the fire, and bring to the boil. Keep an eye on the pot with the simmering water, and now and again just top it up. And then when the stone is soft, the camel meat will be nice and tender. We're going to look now at the goat hair tent, and as it is today, used by the Bedouin tribesmen. We can visit a Bedouin encampment, and I have visited one, and they always give a good welcome to people. It's the desert hospitality. Now we read in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 21 that Noah lived in a tent. That's the first reference. In verse 27 of that same chapter, the tents of Shem are mentioned. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were all tent dwellers. And the people of Israel, under Moses, lived in tents during their 40 years in the wilderness. The Bedouin claim descent from Ishmael. And the Bible says of him, he will be a donkey, a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. We find that in Genesis 16 and verse 12. And many people say, well, that's just as they are. They like to be independent and free spirits. The Bedouin are nomads, wandering by choice, not going to towns very often except to buy supplies. They're happiest in open spaces, in the vast expanse of the desert. As both pasture and water are scarce, they are constantly moving on. They still live in tents made of black goat hair. Now we think of goat hair in this country mainly of being white, because our goats are mainly white. But in the Middle East, and particularly in Israel, the goats are brown or black. And just to cinch it, in the Song of Songs and chapter 1 and verse 5, we read, dark like the tents of Kedar. They have the women's quarters, which are separate from the main guest part of the tent. And it was in this guest part where the men meet together and talk. The men don't really do a lot of work. They look after the encampment. They look after the flocks, the sheep and the goats. But generally speaking, they take a very relaxed attitude to life. It's the ladies who do all the work. And we'll be learning about that a little later on. Now, we said earlier on that the traditions of the Bedouin have remained the same for thousands of years. But nowadays, they are just accepting some new ideas. For instance, one year, about, I think it was 1992, went to a Bedouin encampment and, they, apart from maybe a couple of trucks, they lived in the same way as they'd always lived. But then in 2001, as I was traveling along the road from Bethlehem to the Dead Sea, we passed a Bedouin encampment on our left-hand side. And there the tents were as they'd been before, but there was one difference. Outside and fixed onto the top of the tents were satellite dishes. And so the men now, as well as maybe gambling and smoking and drinking coffee, they're now able to watch television. Psalm 19 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands." And it continues, "In the heavens he has pitched a tent for the sun, which is like a bridegroom coming forth from his pavilions." The black goat hair is woven in strips, and they have the loom, peg looms in the desert, and the ladies do the weaving, and they weave together goat hair and make it into strips the width of the loom. And then the strips are put together, fixed with metal clasps or wooden splinters or needles to make up the wider pieces of goat hair. The goat hair is a marvelous material. When it gets wet, the strands of goat hair expand and make it completely waterproof. When it dries out in the summer season, so it contracts and tiny pinpricks appear. And so it makes it just really like air conditioning. Now, when the little boy grows up in a goat hair tent, and maybe he goes out for the first time at night with his father, a father will say to him that the goat hair is just like the sky. And as he looks through the goat hair tent, so he will see these tiny pinpricks of light which appear like stars in the sky. And so his father will say to the boy, well, God has pitched his tent in the heavens. And it's just like we're covered with a goat hair tent. So, of course, the boy is not frightened anymore, and he regards the outside at night just as if he were in God's tent. The goat hair tent is kept up with poles, and this tent behind me is what is known as a one-pole tent, the smallest tent you can get. This will be regarded as a starter home, if you like, and of course the tent can be added to as the family increases. We read in the scriptures in Psalm 27 and verse 5 that safety is found under the Lord's tent. And then we read that the tents of the upright will flourish, according to Proverbs 14 and verse 11. The tents of the wicked are to be avoided, it says in Psalm 84 and verse 10. And a collapsing tent is a symbol of death and destruction, according to Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse 20. Now, I once heard of a Bedouin who was asked, how do you know if there is a God? And the man replied, how do I know if a man or a camel has passed by my tent last night? By the footprints in the sand. And of course, as we look around us, we can see God's handiwork. We can see that God has created the heavens and the earth. And as it says in Psalm 19, that psalm that we begun with, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. In the heavens, he has pitched a tent for the sun, which is like a bridegroom coming forth from his pavilion.